Hi everyone, today we're going to learn about the Sistine Chapel ceiling. If you have a paper notebook, you need to write down these identifiers, and as we go, I will explain which pictures to paste in. So you're going to write down the identifiers, and then I would paste in this picture of the outside and this picture of the overall room. So this picture of the outside and this picture of the overall room you can paste in right now, and the others I will tell you as we go. So go ahead and pause here to give the paper people a few minutes to get set up, and then you can restart. All right, so a little bit of background info. The artist of the Sistine Chapel is Michelangelo. This is located in Vatican City in Italy, which is the headquarters of the Catholic Church. And if you look at the identifiers, the ceiling frescoes, which we're going to talk about first, are painted much earlier than the other fresco behind the altar. So Michelangelo was hired to paint the Pope's private chapel at the Vatican. This was bon fresco, which means painting done on wet plaster so that the painting adheres as part of the wall. And pretty much all the scenes that we're going to look at and the architectural forms are painted. So it's going to look like there's a ton of moldings and architectural elements on the ceiling, but almost all of it is actually paint. Here is an illustration showing what it looked like before Michelangelo painted it. And so the ceiling here in the center without figures on it, and then he's also going to paint these archways and these triangle shapes here. But other than those sections, all the architectural stuff we see up here is paint. Here is the Sistine Chapel from the outside. I really don't have anything to say about it, but it's just part of the larger complex of buildings at the Vatican. And the Sistine Chapel today, if you're ever in Rome, you can visit it, but it is closed down still for official church events. So here it's being used by the Catholic Church. It also is the location where they always choose a new pope. That discussion and the voting for the new pope always takes place within the Sistine Chapel. So I'm going to show you just a little, just for a minute, like a virtual tour. So when you enter the room, and look up, we're going to talk about 9 different central scenes on the ceiling. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then we're also going to talk about some of the people just below those, which are prophets, and then female figures called sibyls. Around all of the different scenes here, you see, like I said, all this faux architecture. That is all paint. That is not real moldings or anything. And then we also have figures, nude figures, kind of around each scene, which we'll talk about as well. And then here is the altar. So if they're having mass or something in this chapel, this is where the Pope or the priest conducts the mass. And then we're also going to learn about this big fresco, the altar fresco, which is right behind the altar. So there you go. Okay, so I'm going to read to you a little bit here, and then I'll have some notes on the next slide. 9 narrative panels describing the creation as recorded in the Bible book of Genesis run along the crown of the ceiling from God's separation of light and darkness. So that's this part here, where in the Bible it's the creation story where God created the world, separated the light and darkness, to the drunkenness of Noah, all the way over here. Viewers enter the chapel, look up, and walk toward the altar. They review, therefore, in reverse order, the history of the fall of mankind. So this is actually near the entrance. This is near the altar. The Hebrew prophets and ancient sibyls who foretold the coming of Christ appear seated in large thrones on both sides of the central row of scenes. So those are the figures here and here. So when we have a large assemblage of frescoes like this, it can be called a fresco program. And so this is just like the basics of what is there. So we have 9 central ceiling panels, which have stories from early Genesis in reverse order. One of the things that's unique about the Sistine Chapel is that most, but not all, of the Christian art we see from this time period deals with stories from the New Testament and Jesus and the disciples, but Michelangelo chose here to use stories from the Old Testament, from the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, Noah's flood. And the scenes are very serious. So it shows creation, the fall of man, man's redemption, but they're very serious themes. So a lot of art with Jesus is meant to give like a hopeful theme, that sins are forgiven and that kind of thing. But the themes here are very solemn. We are going to see sibyls, who are classical female figures, and a bunch of classical elements that show Pope Julius II as a Renaissance humanist. So we talked about that with the School of Athens that we just looked at by Raphael, where we have all these ancient philosophers represented on the walls of the Pope's private apartments, and kind of, isn't that a little strange that he's chosen classical figures who weren't Christian rather than putting Christian scenes on the walls? So here we have the blending of both religious figures and classical elements, and Pope Julius is really trying to show himself as a Renaissance humanist and an intellectual. And the scenes are interspersed with ignudi, which are young male nudes. And I'll show that again, but we looked at that on the virtual tour, how they are kind of surrounding the scenes. So go ahead and pause here if you need more time to write stuff down. And so here is a diagram of that. My paper people, you can paste in your diagram that is somewhat similar. So we have in the center the 9 scenes, starting with the creation of the world, 3 scenes about the creation story, 3 scenes about Adam and Eve. God creates Adam, God creates Eve, and then they are tempted, they sin and are expelled from the Garden of Eden. And then we have the story of Noah over here, including Noah's Ark and the flood. And then around we have the prophets, which are in orange here, and then the sibyls, which we'll learn about, which are highlighted in pink. So go ahead and paste that in. You can pause here for a moment if you need to. And so I'm just going to show you some specific examples of that, and then we'll look at the specific picture that College Board gives you a picture of, which is the flood. Okay, so along the center of the Sistine ceiling, Michelangelo depicted 9 narrative scenes from the book of Genesis, spanning the time from the creation to the drunkenness of Noah. Michelangelo painted the scenes in reverse chronological order. Michelangelo's unwillingness to paint the 12 apostles, the subject proposed by the Pope, suggests he may have been allowed to play an important role in the evolution of the chapel's iconography. From what we can determine from Michelangelo's art, poetry, and life, he was a deeply thoughtful man of serious convictions. This one that is on the picture, I think, is perhaps the most famous. This is called The Creation of Adam, and it shows God reaching down from heaven to create the first man. Sometimes you'll see a picture of just the hands here. This also shows one of Michelangelo's sketches that he did to prepare. And we see lots of classical elements here. So look at how the human body is idealized. Very, very muscular. The bodies have kind of effortless movement, a very clear understanding of human anatomy. So remember, the Renaissance is about the revival of classical art, Greek and Roman styles. Here is the creation of Eve. This is when Adam and Eve had eaten from the fruit they weren't supposed to, and that's the first sin in the Bible, and they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And then here we have the flood scene. So paper people, you can paste in the flood scene. And you can pause here if you need a minute to do that. This is the ceiling panel from the story of Noah and the flood. And I'll read to you a little bit and then I'll discuss it. So in this fresco, Michelangelo has used the physical space of the water and the sky to separate four distinct parts of the narrative. On the right side of the painting, a cluster of people seeks sanctuary from the rain under a makeshift shelter. On the left, even more people climb to the side of a mountain to escape the rising water. Centrally, a small boat is about to capsize because of the unending downpour. And in the background, a team of men work on building the ark, the only hope of salvation. Up close, this painting confronts the viewer with the desperation of those about to perish in the flood, and makes one question God's justice in wiping out the entire population of the earth, save Noah and his family, because of the sins of the wicked. Unfortunately, from the floor of the chapel, the use of small, tightly grouped figures undermines the emotional content and makes the story harder to follow. So this is the story of Noah and the flood from the Bible. In this story, God looks around the earth and finds that humans have just become sinful and terrible, and they're doing all kinds of terrible things. And God, the only people that he finds that are actually following God and doing what they're supposed to do are Noah and his family. And so God tells Noah to build a huge boat, the ark, and that he's going to flood the earth and wipe out everything and everyone except for Noah and his family. So this is when the flood has started. And so let's just describe here what we see. So we have people trying to get shelter, people trying to escape the rising water. Some people are in a small boat that's about to tip over. And then in the background, we see the ark. Now, we see a lot of classical elements here. Look at these bodies. Like, everybody is super muscular and idealized. And again, that's a Greek or classical element. Now, what this slide is talking about is that up close, when we're looking at it on the screen, for example, we can see desperation and emotion in the people and in their faces, and it has a real emotional impact. But when Michelangelo was finished painting it and he viewed it from the floor, he realized that you kind of lost some of that because the figures are so small. So when he painted it, he was up on scaffolding or like like an kind of like ladder construction type equipment that raised him up. So when he's painting it, he's very close to the ceiling. And then when he took that down, he realized, oh, you really can't get all that emotion from it. And so that's why this is one of the first ones he painted. And after that, he realized, okay, I got to focus on a few major figures to get the point across so that you still get the feeling from it. That was kind of missing from this one. Here are the ignudi. The ignudi are the male nudes that are interspersed between all of the different scenes. So they are there just to be decorative and to represent classical art. Again, it's sort of interesting that this is a religious structure, the Sistine Chapel, and the headquarters of the Catholic Church. But we have these idealized male nudes interspersed, which is a very Greek idea and really has nothing to do with Christianity. And they're seated in all of this classical architecture that Michelangelo has created. Okay, and then we see the prophets. So around the scenes are alternating the prophets and the sibyls. So here are just some examples. The prophets are Old Testament people who foretold the coming of Jesus Christ in the Bible. And I'll just read to you a little bit about this. One of the earlier prophets that was painted is Isaiah, who is relatively youthful, though he is prematurely gray-haired, and his face is ravaged by disturbing thoughts. Deep in meditation, he closes his book and turns in a majestic movement. He is about to drop his left hand, on which his head had apparently been propped, as he listens to one of his accompanying putti, or little cherubs. After the first section of the ceiling was completed in 1510, the planks of the scaffolding were moved, and Michelangelo had his first chance to see how the figures looked from the floor. His response to the 1510 viewing was immediate, and the figures in the second section are dramatically increased in scale. Okay, so one of the things I want you to notice about Isaiah here is look at the twisting of his body and the movement of how his body moves so effortlessly, even though he's just paint. So this is the high Renaissance. This is the height of perfection of all of the Renaissance principles that we've been talking about. So here, Michelangelo has really masterfully managed to capture that same perfection that we see in Greek art and understanding of the human body. And then I want to just go back to the School of Athens for a second, because when we studied that, they talked about how this figure here, which is the philosopher of Heraclitus, was in a pose very similar to Isaiah. And so Raphael and Michelangelo were both working at the Vatican at the same time. And so Raphael definitely took inspiration from this figure on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And they also said that this figure actually looks like Michelangelo looked, who was known for being really moody and kind of a loner, and that's what we have in this figure here. And you can see here the pose is very similar. The main difference is like Isaiah is looking this way and Heraclitus is looking down. All right, now we're going to talk about the sibyls. So my paper people, you have a picture of the Delphic sibyl, and you can paste that in. Go ahead and pause here if you need a moment to paste it in. All right, so the sibyls are kind of like mythology. They're not in the Bible. The Delphic sibyl, which is the one we have, which we'll get to in a minute, is one of 5 ancient Greek prophets who proclaimed the coming of Christ. It connects to prophecy. The Old Testament prophets also foretold Christ. And the Sibyls frame the different scenes from the Bible. So, if you want to kind of summarize that and know what to put down, the Sibyls are not in the Bible, but there was a tradition that believed that these 5 women were from ancient Greece and predicted the coming of Jesus. So they're not biblical, but it's a traditional story of these 5 female Greek prophets who predicted the coming of Christ. So this is another element where we have the blending of classical humanism and Christianity, because these figures are not in the Bible, so like what are they doing here in the Sistine Chapel? But Pope Julius II and Michelangelo are trying to connect Christian elements to classical elements. All right, so I just want to point out this one, the Libyan Sibyl, even though this isn't the picture that we have, because it gives a good example of one of the things we're going to talk about, which is that these women are super muscular. And you can see Michelangelo's drawing over here. So they're all women, but they're super muscular. There are definitely not many women that look this muscular. So it almost looks a little bit masculine instead of feminist, which is one of the characteristics of the Sibyls. Okay, so here is our Sibyl, the Delphic Sibyl, and we're just going to describe her. So we have an idealized young woman. And she's in an illusionary architectural space. Illusionary architectural space. So this is all created with paint. It's not real moldings or anything like that. She definitely looks three-dimensional and like she projects outward. And her clothing and her body form a circular composition. So you kind of see a circular composition here. That is something that we saw in Greek art, like the sculptures of the Parthenon and the Metopes. So it shows classicism because we have real attention to geometry and composition. She also has a twisting pose, which we found in Greek art, so a real understanding of the human body and her twisting pose. And she's looking to the right as if she's just, like if she's just noticed something or like someone just startled her or something like that. And this definitely reflects the Greek idea of balance and proportion. Balance and proportion. So I'm going to add a term right here, actually. So hopefully you remember the artist Polykleitos. Polykleitos is the artist of Doryphorus and wrote the book The Canon, which was about the perfect proportions for a sculpture. And so we see that kind of attention to detail and perfect proportions here. And then, like I said, she is very muscular. She's not soft and feminine like classical women were. So that's just a deviation from classical. In classical Greek art, women were kind of soft, had like a little more meat on their bones. Were just like soft and feminine, where she's very muscular. So the last thing I want to talk about with the Sibyl is I just want us to make a list of things that are classical influences here. So we definitely see Hellenism. Remember how the Hellenistic period from Greek art, which was very dramatic and emotional. So here, for example, is the altar at Pergamon, where we see a lot of twisting, muscular bodies, emotion. So we have a similar idea here. We also see chiaroscuro, which we talked about with Last Supper, is intense contrast between light and dark. So in the great altar at Pergamon, that contrast is created by deeply carving the marble. And here we have it with paint. We also have very sculpted drapery. And classical architecture. Sculpted drapery and classical architecture. And the Sibyls are thought to be inspired by this artwork. This is a classical sculpture that was already in the art collection at the Vatican, so Michelangelo would have been able to see the other artworks that were already there. And it's thought that this is called the Belvedere torso, that this likely inspired the muscular bodies of the Sibyls. And you can go ahead and pause here if you need to. Okay, so we are going to talk about this picture next, but we're going to do a little bit of background info. And you don't have to write all this down if you feel like you know what the Protestant Reformation is. I mean, really, you don't have to write any of it down, but we need to review it for the artworks that we're going to be learning about. So before the 1500s, there was only one church in Western Europe, which was the Catholic Church. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther published a document called the 95 Theses, which were his 95 complaints against the Catholic Church, and he was accusing them of being really corrupt. His number one complaint was the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences, which is when people paid money to the church and received an indulgence, which promised release from the punishment of their sins. In other words, when they died, they could go right to heaven, or in other words, they were paying to get into heaven. And so Martin Luther had studied the Bible, and he believed this is not what the Bible taught, that the Bible taught that salvation or forgiveness of your sins, and therefore going to heaven, was only through faith in Jesus, not through actions or indulgences. This set off just huge controversy and centuries of warfare in Europe. So Martin Luther was put on trial by the Catholic Church. He became a fugitive. The new churches that sprung up were called Protestant and taught Luther's idea of salvation through faith alone. These ideas were spread through preaching and publications, including woodcuts, to reach an illiterate audience. And later in this unit, we have one of those woodcuts to look at. The conflict between Catholics and Protestants led to intense conflict and bloody wars. So that leads us to this fresco. This, if you look back at your identifiers, was painted starting in 1536. The Protestant Reformation started in 1517. So this is years after the Reformation has started, and the Catholic Church is under a serious attack for all of its beliefs, its practices during this time period. So this we're going to see has a very different tone than the other paintings on the ceiling. So this is the altar fresco. Go ahead and paste this in if you need to, pause if you need to. All right, so what this fresco is a Last Judgment. And we have seen the Last Judgment scenes before, where it's the day in the Bible where Jesus returns and everyone is going to be judged. Some of the people are going to go to heaven and some of them are going to go to hell. So it's important to know that this was painted much later than the ceiling. So the Protestant Reformation was already going on. And as a result, the mood of this one is much darker and more serious than the scenes on the ceiling. This is located above the altar where the Pope would lead Mass. So here's the altar down here. You can see the candles. And so this is like looking right over the Pope when he's saying Mass. So I'll show you some elements of it. So in the center, we have Jesus. We have over here the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary often in art has blue. And she's looking down towards the side of the saved, or the people who are going to heaven. All the other people are like saints, important biblical figures, all around. And I'll come back to this with St. Peter in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about the figure of Jesus, all right? So we still have here the figures are very, very muscular, but Jesus's body looks a little bit distorted. It's like his torso is too long. And so not all the figures here are super realistic. Whereas if we compare them to the figures of the ceiling, the figures of the ceiling are like very elegant and perfected. Some of the figures here, I think we could say even look kind of ugly. And so why is that happening? Historians think that it's a way for Michelangelo to represent emotion and like the turmoil of the time period. So he's allowing the figures to be distorted to show the tension of the Reformation happening and the emotion of it. And if we go down a little bit, we have angels blowing trumpets. So the angels are like waking up all the souls, like Jesus is back. This is the judgment day. On this side, the people are being pulled up to heaven. So this is the saved side. Another thing that's sort of different than how we would think and maybe represents the tension of the time is these people who are being pulled up to heaven, they look really heavy. Like these angels are putting in hard work pulling these people up. Where I would think the people would just kind of like float up to heaven very easily. Like they are saved, they're forgiven of their sins. And here it looks like very hard work. Over here, people are literally being beaten down to the hell side. And like here's a demon like about to beat these people over to the hell side. There's even, I'm going to see if I have a picture of it. There's even pictures of like angels punching people down. Over here, like these people are trying to get up and they're like being punched back down. And I'll just show you some other, a couple other people that I have just found interesting over the years. And you don't have to write these down. But this is St. Peter. St. Peter is often depicted in art holding keys. He is considered the first pope by Catholics, or the first leader of the church. And so the idea is that Peter has the keys to God's kingdom. This is St. Bartholomew. Most of the disciples, I think all of them except one, actually died really gruesome deaths. Bartholomew was skinned alive, and he's actually holding like his skin. You can see it has a face on it and a knife. This is St. Catherine. St. Catherine was martyred or killed on the wheel, which is like a terrible, gruesome punishment, and she's holding a broken wheel. Look at this woman, how buff she is. So there's definitely distortion of figures here. And again, it reflects the time period when the Catholic Church is under attack, and so there's a lot more tension and a much darker mood than the other scenes on the Sistine Chapel. So just to kind of review a few things, you know I like to do major takeaways. So Michelangelo is hired to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. In the center, we have scenes from the Old Testament. And then around them, we have prophets and sibyls. Even though there's a lot of religious scenes here, we see a lot of stuff that is not Christian, and it represents humanism or revival of classical elements at the time. So we have all of this architecture that looks very classical. We have the nude ignudi figures, which are very classical, idealized nude bodies. And then we have classical elements within the artworks themselves. So the way that the bodies move, the perfection and idealized bodies, attention to geometry is all very classical. And then remember, the sibyls are not biblical, but they were a tradition that these ancient Greek prophets had predicted the coming of Christ. And we talked about like the perfect planned composition, the classical elements depicted here. And then the Last Judgment fresco is during the Protestant Reformation. It's a Last Judgment, but it has a different mood, and not everything is so perfect. And probably Michelangelo does that to show the tension that's existing at the time.